The first stone struck the front window just as I reached the rusted gate. Glass shattered somewhere inside the old house, and a flock of blackbirds exploded from the roof into the pale morning sky. Behind me, halfway down Briarwood Road, 3 men stood beside the town's only gas station watching me as though I had just stepped across a line no sensible person would cross. One of them raised his hand and shouted for me to turn back. Another slowly shook his head. But before I could decide whether courage and stupidity were sometimes the same thing, the front door opened, and the woman everyone had warned me about looked straight into my eyes and quietly said, "I hoped you wouldn't listen. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Lifeline Vibes if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the courage to see people for who they truly are instead of what others say about them. My name is Rowan Mercer, and I had arrived in the small town of Bellwether only 6 days earlier with everything I owned packed into the back of a faded blue pickup truck. I had not come searching for adventure, redemption, or love. I had come because my uncle had died and left me a struggling hardware store that smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and all the years he had spent refusing to retire. At 34, I had already lost a marriage, a construction business, and most of my confidence. Bellwether was supposed to be a quiet place where I could repair the store, sell it, and return to the city before anyone learned enough about me to be disappointed. But small towns do not allow strangers to remain strangers for long. By my second day, people knew what coffee I ordered, what truck I drove, and that I had once been married. By my fourth, they had started telling me about the woman who lived alone at the top of Briarwood Road. Her name was Maris Vale. Depending on who told the story, she was either a thief, a liar, a murderer, or something worse that no one could define without lowering their voice. The cashier at the grocery store said Maris had destroyed her own family. The barber claimed her husband had disappeared after a violent argument and that she knew where his body was buried. A woman outside the post office warned me that children who wandered near Maris' property returned frightened and silent. Even Sheriff Holden, while helping me replace a broken lock at the hardware store, advised me not to deliver supplies to her house. He spoke politely, but the meaning was clear. Some doors were better left unopened. That I might have followed their advice if Maris had not placed an order through the store that same afternoon. She requested roof sealant, 2 boxes of nails, a replacement window latch, and a sheet of plywood. The order was written in neat handwriting on a torn piece of brown paper and slipped beneath the door before opening time. There was no phone number, only cash folded carefully around the list. My employee, an elderly man named Finch Arlo, saw the name and immediately refused to make the delivery. He said my uncle had stopped going up there years ago. When I asked why, Finch looked toward the front windows as if someone might be listening and said, "Because decent men know when trouble wants to be left alone." That sentence stayed with me. Trouble wants to be left alone. I understood that feeling better than Finch knew. After my business failed, people who had once praised my ambition started describing me as reckless. After my wife left, mutual friends spoke about me with sympathetic caution, as though failure were contagious. Stories had grown around me too, shaped from pieces of truth and filled with assumptions. Perhaps that was why, the following morning, I loaded Maris' order into my pickup and drove toward Briarwood Road while the sun climbed through thin white clouds. The house stood beyond the town limits, surrounded by waist-high grass and old maple trees. It had once been beautiful. Even beneath the peeling paint and sagging porch, I could see the shape of a home that someone had loved. The stone chimney leaned slightly east. Wind chimes hung silent beneath the porch roof. One downstairs window had been boarded up, while another was covered from the inside with a faded quilt. As I approached the gate, the warnings returned to me one by one, each voice louder than the last. Then the stone flew, the window shattered, and the door opened. Maris was younger than I had expected, perhaps 31 or 32, with dark copper hair loosely tied behind her neck. She wore worn jeans, muddy work boots, and a pale green shirt with the sleeves rolled above her elbows. There was no madness in her expression, no cruelty, no sign of the monster the town had described. There was only exhaustion, guarded hope, and a small cut across her palm where she had apparently tried to catch a piece of falling glass. She stared past me toward the men down the road, then stepped aside and invited me in. The inside of the house was clean but nearly empty. Sunlight poured through the broken window and scattered across the wooden floor. The furniture was covered with white sheets, except for a table beside the fireplace where jars of dried flowers stood in careful rows. On the wall hung photographs of Maris with a smiling man and a little boy whose front teeth were missing. In every picture, the boy held Maris' hand as though there were no safer place in the world. That I placed the supplies near the door and asked if she wanted help with the shattered window. She hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to offers that did not hide some price, then nodded. While I measured the frame, she swept the glass into a metal dustpan. Neither of us mentioned the men watching from the road. Neither of us asked why the stone had been thrown. But silence can only carry so much weight before it breaks. Eventually, Maris told me the stone was not the first. Sometimes people left dead animals by the gate. Sometimes they painted words across the fence at night. Once, someone poured fuel around the porch but became frightened before lighting it. I asked why she stayed. She glanced at the photographs and said the house belonged to her son. The boy's name was Ellison. He had been 7 years old when he died. The truth unfolded slowly over the next several hours as we repaired the window beneath the bright afternoon sun. 4 years earlier, Maris had been married to Calder Vale, the eldest son of one of Bellwether's wealthiest families. Calder's father owned farmland, rental properties, and half the buildings along Main Street. To the town, Calder was generous and charming. He donated to the church roof fund, coached children's baseball, and shook every hand offered to him. But inside the house on Briarwood Road, he was violent. Maris explained it without drama, which made it harder to hear. Calder controlled the money, chose who she could visit, checked every mile on her car, and apologized after hurting her with flowers and promises. She had tried to leave twice. Each time, he threatened to take Ellison away and convinced the town she was unstable. The third time she attempted to escape, Calder followed her truck along the old quarry road. It was a clear spring afternoon. Ellison sat in the passenger seat holding a red pinwheel they had bought at a roadside stand. Calder's truck struck them from behind near a sharp bend. Maris lost control. Her vehicle rolled down the embankment and landed against a tree. She survived with broken ribs and a crushed shoulder. Ellison did not. Calder disappeared that same day. Maris told the sheriff what had happened, but there were no witnesses. Calder's abandoned truck was later discovered beside the river with blood on the steering wheel. His family claimed Maris had killed him after the crash and hidden his body. They used their influence, their money, and their grief to turn the town against her. Though no charges were ever filed, people decided guilt did not require proof. The story changed as it spread. Soon, Maris was no longer a mother who had lost her child. She was the woman who murdered her husband and somehow caused her son's death too. I stopped working and looked at the photograph of Ellison holding the red pinwheel. A terrible anger rose inside me, not only toward Calder but toward every person who had found it easier to believe a powerful family than a frightened woman. I asked why she had never left Bellwether. Her answer was simple. Ellison was buried beneath the maple tree behind the house. Calder's family had tried to move the grave to their private cemetery, but Maris had fought them and won. Leaving town felt like abandoning the only part of her son she could still protect. That first day, I stayed until the window was sealed and the new latch worked. Before leaving, I noticed her roof sagging above the kitchen. I said I could return the next morning to inspect it. Maris looked uncertain, then asked why I was helping her. I almost gave her a noble answer, but honesty seemed more respectful. I told her that everyone needed at least one person who did not walk away. The next morning, half the town seemed to know where I had been. A woman refused to enter the hardware store while I stood behind the counter. 2 customers returned items they had purchased the previous week. Finch warned me that associating with Maris would ruin the business before I had a chance to save it. Sheriff Halden arrived near noon and asked whether Maris had told me her version of events. I said she had told me what happened. He corrected me sharply, saying she had told me what she claimed happened. Something in his tone disturbed me. It was not skepticism. It was fear. That afternoon, I drove back to Briarwood Road. Maris was kneeling in the garden, clearing weeds around a row of white lilies. In daylight, the property did not feel haunted. It felt neglected, like a wounded thing everyone had chosen to punish instead of heal. I inspected the roof and found storm damage severe enough to threaten the entire kitchen ceiling. Maris could not afford professional repairs, so I offered to do the work in exchange for meals and help organizing the hardware store's old records. She laughed for the first time, a soft surprised sound that seemed unfamiliar even to her. Over the next several weeks, our lives formed a quiet rhythm. I arrived shortly after sunrise with lumber and tools. Maris made coffee strong enough to remove paint. We repaired the roof, replaced porch boards, and cleared vines from the chimney. During the hottest part of each afternoon, we sat beneath the maple tree near Ellison's grave and spoke about everything except the town. She told me Ellison had loved thunderstorms, cinnamon toast, and making up names for clouds. I told her about my failed business and how I had borrowed money against my home trying to save it. I admitted that my wife had not left because I failed financially. She left because I became bitter, distant, and impossible to reach. Maris never tried to excuse me or condemn me. She simply listened. In her presence, I began to understand that second chances were not gifts handed to people after they proved they deserved them. Sometimes they began when someone saw the worst chapter of your life and did not assume it was the ending. The town's hostility grew as the house improved. Someone spray-painted murderer across the repaired gate. A brick smashed the hardware store's display window. Finch quit, saying he had grandchildren to think about. Then Calder's father, Aldrin Vale, visited the store in a polished black car. He was a tall man with silver hair and a voice so calm it felt rehearsed. He offered to purchase the store for far more than it was worth, provided I leave Bellwether within a week. When I refused, his smile disappeared. He warned me that Maris had destroyed everyone who tried to protect her. After he left, I checked the old security camera above the counter, hoping it had recorded our conversation. The system had not worked in years. But while searching the back office for wiring diagrams, I found a locked metal cabinet beneath my uncle's desk. Inside were receipts, ledgers, photographs, and a small digital recorder sealed in a plastic bag. The recorder contained my uncle's voice that he had spoken to Calder the morning of the crash. Calder had come into the hardware store furious, buying fuel, rope, and a replacement taillight. My uncle had sensed something wrong and secretly recorded the conversation. Calder admitted that Maris had left him and said he would bring her back even if he had to run her off the road. My uncle confronted him, but Calder threatened to destroy the business and harm Finch's family. Hours later, after news of the crash spread, my uncle hid the recorder. He had intended to give it to the police, but someone broke into the store that night. Frightened and ashamed, he kept silent. There was more. The receipts showed Calder had purchased supplies under a false name several times in the months after his supposed disappearance. My uncle had tracked the purchases to a cabin across the state line owned by one of Aldrin Vale's shell companies. Calder had not died. His family had hidden him. That I called Sheriff Holden, but before he arrived, the electricity inside the store went out. Through the front glass, I saw Aldrin's black car parked across the street. Two men entered through the back door. One struck me behind the ear, and I fell against the desk. They searched the cabinet while I lay dazed on the floor. Fortunately, I had already slipped the recorder into my jacket. When one of them grabbed me, I swung a heavy ledger into his face and ran through the stockroom, escaping into the alley. That I drove directly to Maris' house. She was on the porch when I arrived, and the moment she saw the blood on my collar, she understood that the past had finally found us. We listened to the recording together at the kitchen table while afternoon sunlight moved slowly across the floor. Maris covered her mouth when Calder's voice filled the room. For 4 years, people had treated her memories like lies. Now the truth sat between us, undeniable and alive. Sheriff Holden arrived 20 minutes later, but he was not alone. State investigators stepped from two unmarked vehicles behind him. I had sent a copy of the recording and photographs of the documents to an attorney in the city before leaving the store. Halden's shoulders sank when he realized the evidence was no longer something he could bury. Under questioning, he admitted Aldrin Vale had paid him to mishandle the original investigation and destroy tire mark photographs from the quarry road. Calder was arrested 3 days later at the cabin. Aldrin, Sheriff Halden, and several others were charged with obstruction, bribery, assault, and conspiracy. The news spread beyond Bellwether, forcing the town to confront not only what one family had done, but what everyone else had allowed. Some people apologized to Maris. Many did not. Shame often makes people quieter, not kinder. But the stones stopped. The threats ended. For the first time in years, children rode bicycles past the house without being pulled away by frightened parents. Maris did not suddenly become whole because the truth came out. Justice could not return Ellison or erase 4 years of loneliness. There were mornings when she stood at the kitchen window and cried without making a sound. There were days when I woke believing I had no right to remain in her life because everything I touched eventually failed. Healing was not a triumphant moment. It was a collection of ordinary choices. I kept returning. She kept opening the door. By autumn, the hardware store had recovered. People from neighboring towns began shopping there after reading about the case. I hired 2 young workers and turned the back office into a community workshop where families could learn basic home repairs for free. Maris started helping on Saturdays. She was better with customers than I ever was, especially those who entered embarrassed because they could not afford professional help. The following spring, we restored the garden around Ellison's grave. Maris planted red poppies beneath the maple tree because they reminded her of his pinwheel. On the anniversary of his death, the sky was clear and bright. We sat together in the grass while sunlight moved through the leaves. Maris reached for my hand and said she used to believe surviving meant she had betrayed her son. Now she believed living kindly was how she carried him forward. Months later, standing on the repaired porch, I asked her whether she had truly hoped I would ignore the town's warnings that first morning. She smiled and said she had stopped hoping for most things by then, but when she saw my truck coming up the road, some small part of her believed I might be different. That I told her I had not been different. I had simply known what it felt like to become a story other people told incorrectly. Our friendship became love quietly. There was no sudden confession beneath pouring rain, no dramatic promise that pain would never return. There were shared breakfasts, repaired fences, long drives for supplies, and evenings spent sorting photographs of Ellison into an album. There were difficult days when Maris pulled away and moments when I became afraid of losing what we were building. But we learned that love was not rescuing someone from their past. It was standing beside them while they discovered they were stronger than what had happened. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Lifeline Vibes. Your engagement helps stories of compassion, courage, and second chances reach people who may desperately need to hear that they are not alone. A year after I first climbed Briarwood Road, Maris and I opened the old house to the town. We created a small foundation in Ellison's name that helped parents and children escape dangerous homes. The same rooms that had once held fear became filled with counselors, volunteers, warm meals, and sunlight. Some townspeople came because they wanted forgiveness. Others came because they finally understood that silence had consequences. Maris welcomed them without pretending the past had not happened. Forgiveness, she said, did not mean calling cruelty acceptable. It meant refusing to let cruelty decide what kind of person she would become. Special request, please comment. I would have opened the door, if you believe one act of courage can change someone's entire life. On the first bright morning of the foundation's opening, I stood near the gate watching families arrive. The repaired windows reflected the blue sky. Children ran across the lawn while red poppies swayed beneath the maple tree. Maris stood on the porch greeting a frightened young mother who had driven 200 miles with her daughter. The woman hesitated at the bottom step, ashamed and uncertain, carrying the same expression Maris must have worn years earlier when she first tried to leave Calder. Maris walked down, took the woman's trembling hand, and led her toward the open door. As she passed me, our eyes met. In that moment, I remembered the broken window, the watching men, and the warning voices behind me. I remembered how close I had come to turning around. Maris smiled through tears and quietly said the words that had changed both our lives: that I hoped you wouldn't listen. And standing there beneath the warm morning sun, surrounded by people who had found safety because one forgotten woman had refused to become what the town called her, I finally understood that sometimes the most important thing we can do is walk toward the person everyone else has abandoned, knock on the door everyone fears, and stay long enough to learn the truth.